up, everybody? This is Carrick with ACG, and once again, it's my continuing mission to bring you reviews that aren't 2 minutes long or filled with sponsored bullcrap. What is the review for today? It's Immortals Fenyx Rising: The Lost Gods, the third in the package of DLC that wraps up the entire story for Immortals Fenyx Rising. You may be thinking to yourself, my God, we're reviewing DLC now? Yes, we are. There's some bigger reviews coming out in the next day or so, but I wanted to look at this game because it's trying to do something a little bit different. What is that? It takes the normal gameplay of Immortal Fenyx Rising, turns it isometric, and, well, also into Diablo Light. This has you play as Ash, who's either a lumberjack or some kind of Arbor Day terrorist for the amount of forest they end up cutting through as you go through 8+ hours of isometric gameplay as this new warrior, taking over the mantle of a confused SOB who just shops for their own life's upgrades inside the mini-malls of enemies' bowels. All of this so Ash can go out and find the gods that have left Olympus at the starting of the original title. It's come full circle. This is the last DLC, wrapping it up. And yes, it is true. They call this new view of the gameplay God's Eye. And if you look at this footage and you think to yourself, dude, that's top-down isometric, well, wait just a bit, because if there's one thing Fenyx Rising's DLC seemed to lose, it's the glossary from the original friggin' game. This title comes out in just a couple days for all of the platforms that the original game was on. As always, if you like the video, give it a thumbs up, maybe subscribe, and you can always check out the Patreon. Let's start with graphics first. Now, one thing to remember first and foremost is that this is still Fenyx Rising. What I mean by that is that while changing the camera angle and adjusting various parameters, that doesn't mean you're going to be staring down the double-ended barrel of some uber dark Warhammer game with 1,000 new attacks. It's not like that. However, that also helps the game. I, for one, love the Elysium Fields look of Fenyx, the soft colors, the super saturated hues, and the almost World of Warcraft kind of look that the game had. The same holds true here. So, everything good with Fenyx continues when it comes to graphics. And that also includes the performance, whether you have the FOV setting high or low, which allows for you to zoom in or zoom out, and I'll show some samples of that, you still get about the exact same performance as you got with the original game. What's more than half bad, though, is the measuring stick that this will be. For the trip hazards, the trepidations, just downright terrible things that can happen if you willy-nilly change a camera angle on a title that is established in another way. This is something we've seen in mods before. The game loses that grandiose feeling of verticality that the first game relished in. It just basked in it like a wet hog in shit. Half of Fenyx Rising's original fun was crawling up the ramshackle crumblings of some ballsack of an ancient mythological statue and roostering from the top. While the platform has the sense of verticality sometimes, it's not done incredibly well. Shadows and details are really not defined enough regardless of how you adjust the lighting. And this shows the game's original design chops coming through in this new type of camera angle, which can make both traversing as well as taking out flying enemies far more troublesome than they should be in a game like this. The camera view is also susceptible to issues due to the game's original viewpoint and not using transparencies. This is something we've seen in a lot of games. Sadly, Ubisoft has neglected to use a transparency system so that the terrain and the obstructions are always in your way. Remembering, of course, that this game was originally designed as something completely different. It's not the same thing as a title that was always designed as isometric. Now, by the completion of the game, I felt that the additional enemy in the title was the camera system. The inability to go in there and adjust it and really tilt it the way I wanted meant that a lot of times when I was in battle or when there were enemies spawning in battle, I was having to use the other systems in the game which really weren't exactly prepared to back that up, including sound, which I'll talk about in a second. Overall, graphically, I actually do like the changes here. I do like a lot of the new areas, and I think that this new island is very cool looking. Performance is also very good. However, once again, when you look at situations like this, you can't just go in and change a bunch of things when it comes to the way that the game is actually displayed and not take even more into account. I'm sure they did what they could, but a transparency system of some kind would help tremendously. Or at the very least, start looking at maybe where your enemy spawns will be, which I'll talk about in the game section. Actually, which I'll talk about right now. Gameplay and a bit about the story. A game is a construct to secure unrestricted freedom with a highly restricted setup. That's Vineet Raji Kapoor, who I have no clue who he is. I just saw that quote and I was like, hey man, that actually fits in this title. I love that quote for this game. We enter into a DLC with the constructions of those past experiences as expectations for the expansion, and it's not always that way. And here we have a title where the developers have stated, we're actually going to break it. We're actually going to go out there and we're going to change some things. I think that's awesome. Lost Gods has to be taking on the persona of a completely different character exploring a new location and a new camera to really make you feel like it's doing something different. Otherwise, it's just, well, continued story DLC. I think that works. While you're still out there collecting resources to upgrade weapons and armor, the systems themselves have undergone a pretty significant change in the way they're set up. So you end up unlocking these abilities or these powers, and you can add enhancements to them. Think of almost like a jewel system, except the jewels can be interspersed between any item in the game. Not even items really, but the moves themselves. And I like the flexibility here. It gives one option, meaning 4, 5, maybe 6 or 7 different things. And it really does change up the game. For example, you can attach an enhancement that will let you use the sword in mid-air for attacks, or you can have that same slot used up by something else, meaning it's going to change the entire way the game plays because you won't be able to swing your sword in the air. I admit at first this is a bit confusing, especially because I think for a lot of gamers they usually expect those kind of things to just be unlocked on the item itself. Here you can move them in and out, especially when you don't have a lot of slots on your axe or your sword ability, and especially at the starting, it can be a little bit of a trial, and some of that challenge is based purely on their language. I mean, even if you look at this HUD, it says equip essences on divine influences to gain additional effects. That's a pretty soft sentence already. And how do you get to these? By clicking on heroic gifts. And it is nested, but that's just a lot of wordage for 1 or 2 things that should be a little bit easier. And it does feel a little bit like this is one of those developers who didn't want to use the word mana, so they called it esprit de corps, and then everyone promptly forgot and switched back halfway through. There's a lot of times when you're going in here and you're hearing an explanation or you're seeing an explanation, and it can take just an extra second for you to really parse exactly what's going on. Does this show that Ubisoft just isn't necessarily incredibly experienced with this type of game? Probably so. The original Fenyx probably handled this a little bit better, and their desire to switch may be more of a desire to switch versus an actual need to. Luckily, it also dramatically changes the way everything in the game feels. For example, a simple switch of a Poseidon power on one of your skills means that the shield bash may go from freezing enemies to stunning them to doing the same thing in the air, to sucking in enemies nearby when you hit. Or they can be moved to the faster stamina building sword. The only issue there is that when an enemy is frozen in this game, you really can't damage them. So maybe that skill is actually best left on something else. I like that. There's a ton of flexibility, and I was having a good time switching it around, and I could tell right away when a build was not for me. This also means you have to hoof it to an altar to do any of these kind of things, whether it be saving, upgrading, resetting the world so that you can go back out and grind for items to upgrade and so forth. Now, enemies will attack you left and right as you're collecting these and performing the various quests for the gods to get them to perform miracles like fixing bridges or repairing massive contraptions so you can continue on. You also will be going into the same structured underworld dungeons of the first game and handling some of the same type of puzzles. I admit I'm a sucker for those areas and puzzles. I dig them in the original game. However, like everything else here, they're slightly different feeling with that new viewpoint and feel a little bit less mystical and awe-inspiring than the original title did. Nevertheless, this is a game that as you continue to play it, it gets more and more fun. I certainly was looking at this, especially in the first hour or two, and thinking, there's some issues here, especially because there was one particular jump the game required me to do, and I could not see the jump due to the damn camera. I actually couldn't see the ledge. I was messing around for almost 2 hours, and suddenly zoomed out the camera, have to go into the options, by the way, to do so, and saw where that jump was actually requiring me to go. That's a little bit hedgy, and once again shows that adjusting things like this can bring up a couple issues. I'm fine with all this, though. I think it's interesting. It takes what's familiar and adjusts it a little bit. When it comes to control and it comes to all of those different things in the terrain itself, that's all there. All the jumping, the platforming, the puzzling, all there. Just a little bit different than the other games. And speaking of what's a little bit different, let's talk about fun factor for a second. It is quite fun, though I have some issues there that I've talked about. But I kept playing as I tried to figure out what was going on, which I think is a testament here. I did get frustrated, but I continued to push on and continue to think, oh, maybe I need to upgrade a weapon or what have you. While I was doing that, I was just getting better at the game. And it is like the other games where you don't have an RNG for a ton of weapons dropping or anything like that. It's more along the lines of you setting up what kind of percentage of chances you have of an orb for stamina or health coming back. And that combat in this way is about the same as it was in Fenyx Rising. What I mean by that is it's still very tight for the most part, though I think parries are sort of difficult to actually time just because of the distance from the screen. It's still a blast, though, and once again, as I continued to play, got more and more fun. Now, I moved the sound, music, and voice section here because, frankly, not a lot has changed in this title, and that's expected, sort of, for a DLC. This isn't like the DLC prior where it goes to a completely different thematic land. The music's fine. There's a motivation behind it that's a little bit of that adventure kind of percussion-heavy instrument music that we get a lot of times. And, of course, when you're in the middle of battle, sneaking past a bunch of different minotaurs and a dude who looks like Jabba the Hutt times about 20 times worse. That kind of stuff is really cool. It didn't play a lot, though. There are times where you will be playing the game and there's just no music as you're exploring the actual environment. And that brings us to sound. It's just okay. This is all directly from the main game itself that I could tell. They work, their average sound effects, they do their job, and after many hours, I didn't really feel like they were on my nerves. I will say that because of the viewpoint and the way the enemies spawn and how many can spawn later in the game or with the higher difficulty, I would have liked a bit more of an outrange stinger or something that was a little bit more telling that there might be more enemies in a particular location. But that's just me. Now it brings up voice, and speaking of just me, I don't think anybody agreed on the voice of the original game. In Fenyx Rising, you either like the world police looking characters and the odd humor, or you didn't. The same exactly goes here. That is fine. I liked Athena and a couple of the others, and again, it's cool to see the characters that you were, which is Fenyx, and how they're in charge now, or at least a higher up. It's actually sort of awesome to feel like, hey, I was that character, and now they're somewhat in control. I'll just say mostly unchanged from the original. And that brings us to the rating. You guys know me. I rate games, buy, wait for sale, rent, or never touch it again rating system. For the cost in DLC, this is well worth it. It changes things up. It is actually quite enjoyable when it comes to the combat, but it doesn't make the adjustment perfectly fine. A lot of games don't. Not every game is going to be your top 10 tier title. This is more of a middle ground title, but it is doing something a little bit different, felt good, and I like to re-explore the land. As a wind down for this series, or at least the way this series is actually done right now, this is something that was sort of cool to see Ubisoft try to go out and do. They changed some things up, a little bit of a problem here and there, but overall quite enjoyable to play. Also, changing those skills and those abilities, huge differences to the way the game plays, and I think that that is, at its core, actually quite impressive, especially because you didn't necessarily have to get that, and I wasn't quite sure we were going to. Whether it's a little bit cumbersome or not, well, yeah, that's for sure something that's going on. Anyway, that's it for me. If you guys like the video, give it a thumbs up. If you dislike it, give it a thumbs down. Maybe join the Patreon. It would absolutely help in this day and age. You guys will be seeing some other reviews coming from me in the next couple days. Peace out. Enjoy the rest of your week. Stay safe. Bye-bye.